So here we are at the end of our trail. Thank you for sticking the long haul out, but our narrative will come to fruition today. I've been arguing that the model of Western thought that we think of as the curriculum was developed in this period by this civilization. And we've tried to explain the various reasons for it, and we will conclude reviewing those reasons at the very end of this lecture. But for this session, I want to talk about Aristotle in particular, the student of Plato, and the development of what we have come to think of as the Western curriculum. So here is a man who is a good 43 years younger than Plato of Athens. Aristotle, born in 384. So he's a figure of the 4th century entirely. And well after the end, he's born a generation beyond the Peloponnesian War that gave so much focus to Thucydides and Euripides and Plato. He was a polymath. He defined the idea of a polymath, a man of just abundant, extraordinary range. He wrote about, as I say here, everything. He delved into fields that we would call physics, biology, zoology, metaphysics, logic, ethics, aesthetics, poetry, theater, music, rhetoric, psychology, linguistics, economics, politics, meteorology, geology, and government. He was a dominant figure, a towering figure in Western thought well into the 17th century AD. His systematic and integrated approach, since it was a great schematic that he proposed, a way of organizing all knowledge into one big major system, a systemic whole. And this approach created what in effect became, I would argue, the Western curriculum. Medieval thinkers, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thinkers alike, referred to him simply as the philosopher. If you read Aquinas or anyone, if you read Maimonides, and somebody refers to, or Al-Farabi, the Islamic philosopher, if any of them refer to the philosopher, it is always to Aristotle that they refer. I mentioned here the northern connection. He's born in Stagira in northern Greece, and this becomes very significant because he had powerful connections to the Macedonian royal house. He spent 20 years studying with Plato at the Academy in Athens, but after Plato's death, which would have been in 347, when Aristotle was approximately 37 years old, 36 or 37 years old, still a young man, he leaves Athens. And a few years later, in 343, he's invited by the king of Macedonia, to tutor his son. Philip II's son, of course, is Alexander, the Great, as he is surnamed, born in 356, who will spend a very eventful 33 years before his death in Asia in 323. And, the famous story of Julius Caesar on his 33rd birthday saying, well, by this age, Alexander had conquered the entire world. And where am I? What have I done at this point? He would have been 13 years old when he was brought in as a tutor by Philip, when Aristotle would have been brought in as the tutor. Plato, of course, is the absolute major influence on Aristotle, so deeply because Plato established the entire set of approaches, questions, challenges that Aristotle had to respond to. He doesn't see completely eye to eye with his mentor, and the radically different approaches to basic problems is at the core of that famous fresco of Raffaello in the Vatican, that one detail of which I show on the right, of the two of them in the center of all the classical philosophers. And it's a huge fresco. There is Plato with his, on the left, with his index finger pointed up to the world of forms, the resting place of higher reality is above. And there is Aristotle on the right, pointing out into the world, gesturing at the stuff and substance of the sensory world around us. This is where you study. This is where you look for answers. This is how you begin investigation. So this epitome or epitomizing of the essential differences that we're going to discuss between Plato and Aristotle. He founds a school of his own, the Lyceum, from which we get in all modern language, the Lycée or the Liceo. In 335, he goes back to Athens, establishes his school, because by 335, Alexander is 21 years old, well on his way, doesn't need the old man hanging around anymore, trying to teach him algebra or whatever. And he founds the Lyceum or Lyceum. And his followers later on will get called the Peripatetic school of philosophers. And he generates a series of major works, also a series of minor works, but they go on and on and on. The major elements being the so-called organon, which is the logic and rhetoric, studies in logic, argument, and rhetoric, physics, metaphysics, which literally means, because it followed on the bookshelf next to the physics, so is metaphysics. Next to the physics is the metaphysics, which is the study of being in its most abstract. The ethics, the most famous, he wrote two sets of ethics, actually. The Nicomachean ethics are the ones that students are asked to read all the time in college. The politics, the De Anima on the soul, and the poetics. These were not direct books from the hand of Aristotle. He lectured, and these were student notes and study aids taken down by his most faithful students and organized by the number one assistant and student, sort of his second in command, Theophrastus, who himself was a thinker of note, but who is responsible for the gathering, naming, and organizing of all the lectures that constitute, as quotes often, the direct teachings of Aristotle himself. And what I want to do here is go through some of these. There's an overarching approach, but I want to look at it in the context of specific arenas of study. And the most basic one, and in some ways the most important one, is the organon. Aristotle wrote 6 books on the basics of definition, how you define meaning, logic, analysis, critical analysis, the constructions of argument and rhetoric and the delivering of argument, that evolved into what will later be called the trivium of the classic liberal arts. There were 7 liberal arts in the ancient curriculum. The group of 3, the trivium, which were, of course, trivial, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Those were, if you will, the literary studies of the curriculum, of that part of the liberal arts. And then there was the quadrivium, the group of 4, and those were music, geometry, mathematics. It was all the quantitative study. So the organon, the books on logic and rhetoric, defined a way of organizing formal analysis of propositions and syllogistic logic, analytics as it was called in the ancient world, that stood as the main way of thinking about logic until the 19th century, until mathematical logic develops in the mid-19th century on the backs of people like the great American philosopher Charles Saunders Peirce, until that movement begins and reaches its epitome in the late 19th, early 20th, well, all the way to now, really. Perhaps the greatest philosopher America ever produced is a logician who's still going strong by the name of Saul Kripke, who's revolutionized syllogistic logic, propositional logic. Aristotle developed the so-called square of opposition that you see as a model on the right in the teaching of logic, in which the rules that govern statements are derived in the square. So you see in the square of opposition, there are contraries and contradictories. Contrary statements are those in which both statements cannot be true at the same time, but both may be false at the same time. And contradictory statements are such that if one is true, the other must be false. So you see the every S is P is the A in the upper left of the square, and the E, it's contrary. No S is P is on the right. They both may be false because there might be some S that is P. And then the contradictories. So if it is true that every S is P, it's got to be false. If you look in the lower right at O, that some S is not P. And you may have studied logic in college, and it was most likely Aristotelian logic. And you were taken through exercises that looked at syllogisms, the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion, trying to figure out whether the conclusion was valid or not. So that if the first proposition was that some people have red hair, and then the minor proposition is Mary has red hair, and then you could draw a conclusion from that, etc., and it would either be valid or not valid. So he literally invents the idea of thinking about thinking in terms and language in terms of definition, classification, and hierarchies. So he develops at the very foundation of his thought an approach to every science that tries to see the world as a complexity that has to be organized in classes with definitions surrounding those classes so that you could distinguish class A from class B, a full taxonomy, and that these taxonomies are often hierarchical. And he understood this in his bones, and he introduced rules to use in any science that he was going to approach. So his approach in physics and his approach in biology, and he's like Linnaeus in that he wants to classify animals by function, vertebrates by body forms, all sorts of things. And that the rules that govern this organization of classes and definitions are the same rules he's going to use in analyzing governments, in analyzing ethics and how that works, and in analyzing mind, the minds of humans, the minds of animals, the minds of plants, if you will. We'll see what we mean by that. He says in one of his works, The Parts of Animals, De Partibus, as it is known in Latin, In all study and investigation, be it exalted or mundane, there appear to be two types of proficiency. One is that of exact scientific knowledge, while the other is a generalist understanding. An example of what I mean is the question of whether one should take a single species and state its differentia, but we'll use the Latin word here, and look at a single species, and what is it that makes this species a species? What's the difference that makes it differ from other similar species independently? Or should we first set down common attributes or a common character? In other words, should we come from the angle of the difference, or should we come from the angle of the genus? Or to put it another way, should we start classifying top down or bottom up? And he understood that science and thought in general could take both and use fruitfully both approaches. That in organizing a vast classification hierarchy of everything that exists in the world, you can approach it bottom up or top down. So he adopts a system of definition that satisfies both approaches and leads to hierarchical classification. Genus is the universal of a definition. Differentia, the specific difference, as it's often called in English, is the particular of the definition. So man is the rational animal in early definitions. Man is an animal. What is the specific difference that makes a human being existentially different from all the other animals? It's the rational element that distinguishes the human from the others. So he uses the example at one point, triangle and quadrilateral, or if you will, another way, think of it as a three-sided figure and a four-sided polygon, have the genus plane figure, okay, in plane geometry, but the former, the triangle, has the differentia three-sided, and the latter has the differentia four-sided. Just an example of his classification systems. He uses the term essence in using the Latin word, the essentia, because most of these terms will eventually be known for their Latin roots later on. An essence is literally what a particular thing is. Another thing of the same kind has the same essence. So the essence of each thing, a quote from metaphysics, is what is said to be propter se in itself, for being you is not being musical, since you are not by your very nature musical. What then you are by your very nature is your essence. So you can say, well, Fred plays the piano, Fred is musical, but it isn't his nature. It's accidental that he learned to play the piano and is musical. Essentially, something else by nature. So he starts dividing things between accidents and things that are necessarily essential in the definition of a thing. He, early on in describing and classifying things in the world, has recourse to defining causation. Remember where the pre-Socratics had begun. They wanted to know how you explain the changes in the world of sensed objects, how water turns into ice, for instance, or what any other, how an acorn turns into an oak. And they began to experiment with ideas of causation. Well, he brings this classifying mind to bear and says, I've analyzed causation, and there are four types of causation. Aition is the word, I show it in that paragraph below. And indeed, causation, causa, is again a Latin word. The Greek word, as he used it, would have been closer, Aizion would have been closer to explanation or explanatory factor. Something's happened, or something is observed in the world, or something exists, and you want to give the why of it. You want to explain it. There are 4 angles into that explanation, according to Aristotle. So to know something is to know its causes. And he says in that quote in the middle of the page there, knowledge is the object of our inquiry, and men do not think they know a thing till they have grasped the why of, which is to grasp its primary cause. A quote from the Physics. There are 4 causes, each corresponding to a particular question. The first 2 of them, material cause and formal cause, he says he has in common with Plato. Plato addressed 2 of the 4 causes in the same way that he would. Plato then, in the quote, declared himself thus on the points in question. It is evident from what has been said that he has used only 2 causes, that of the essence, the formal cause, and the material cause, for the forms are the causes of the essence of all other things. Remember, Plato, there was the form dog, dogness, that existed apart from all actual physical dogs. The essence of it, the form, the form, the central idea of it, the eidos of it, the paradigma, the paradigm of it, was this really existing essence that the actual dog, the physical dog, Fido and Rover and Rin Tin Tin, were material realizations of that form, but were imperfect in their participation in the great abstract, perfect principle of the form. So Plato's world of physical objects and the realm of forms define in a certain way material cause and formal cause. Now, Aristotle says in the Metaphysics on material cause, that from which as imminent material, immediate in your face material, a thing comes into being. For example, the bronze is the cause of the statue. So you make a statue out of bronze or a saucer out of silver. That's the material cause of the statue or the saucer. And so are the classes which include these. We'll get into that later. The formal cause is the pattern. That is the definition of the essence and the classes which include this. For example, the ratio 2-to-1 and number in general are causes of the octave. Okay, the musical octave. There are ratios involved and which give them their form and the parts included in the definition. He's going to, even concretely, he's going to say the essence dogness is the formal cause of Fido, not the material cause. That's the actual imminent material, the flesh out of which Fido is constituted. There are also, though, he wants to raise 2 other causes, 2 other ways to explain how something is or came to be. There is the efficient cause, this third cause, sometimes called the agent cause, that from which the change or the resting from change first begins. For example, the advisor is a cause of the action, and the father a cause of the child. And in general, the maker is a cause of the thing made, and the change producing of the changing. So there's a little picture on the lower left, which we'll talk about in a minute. But if the object we're concerning ourselves with is a table, a dining table, well, somebody designed it, or somebody actually built it. And so, which is and answering everything you would want to know about that table that's sitting in the middle of the dining room. One of the questions is going to be, what's it made of? Another one of the questions is going to be about its design, its essential shape, the like. The third question, in effect, that he wants answered is, well, how was it made or who made it? And then there is very important to him, and it's going to be very central to much of his thought, the so-called final cause or purpose cause, the end, that for the sake of which a thing is. For example, he says, health is the cause of walking. For why does one walk, we say? That one may be healthy. And in speaking thus, we think that we have given the cause. So why do you do it? Because I want to be healthy. The same is true of all the means that intervene before the end. So they're intermediate purposes and causes. When something else has put the process in motion, as for example, thinning, dieting, you mean, or purging, or drugs, or instruments intervene before health is reached. For all these are the sake of the end. These are all stages that led up and were organized as part of an intentional endpoint. Though they differ from one another, and that some are instruments and some are actions. So in that little diagram at the bottom left, the material cause of that dining room table is wood. The formal cause is the design. Somebody sat down and thought it through or drew a picture or whatever they did. The efficient cause is the actual instruments of carpentry and the carpenter or joiner, whomever made this table. And the final cause is we need something to eat dinner on. So we thought this would suit the purpose, and that's why we're here. Now, two terms in that box that you'll see on screen that bear on the concept of final cause. And I introduce this because these terms will be used variously when discussing Aristotle in other arenas, even in the ethics and the politics. One is the telos, from which we get the word teleological, the end for which something is done. So for Aristotle, nature itself, the universe, everything in the universe is teleological because things in the world have functions. Things, even objects have functions. We moderns tend not to think of it this way, but the ancients, in fact, I'll explain better if we look at the second term, the second bullet, the term arete. The word for virtue, which we use almost exclusively in a moral sense, moral virtue, was used by the Greeks to convey a general excellence or fulfillment of purpose. So that a knife has the function, telos, of cutting. And so its virtue, its arete, is to be sharp. So we loosely think in these terms, I suppose, when we say, this is a good knife, meaning knives have purposes, they have functions, and this is a good fulfiller of the function and seems to be well made, etc. But they regarded the entire universe this way. This was not a soulless universe for them. The stuff around had function and purpose and tended towards that function. It wanted to fulfill that function. It was a world in which you thought of as better tables and lesser tables, better knives and lesser knives, if you will. We had mentioned earlier when we were looking at some of the pre-Socratics that using causes, Aristotle was able to explain much about the changes in the natural world that the pre-Socratic philosophers were at their wits' end trying to account for. So the earlier people saw substantial change becoming, as they called it, kinesis, change, kinetics, and wanted to explain what that was about. And early on, everybody was onto the idea, and Aristotle and Plato confirmed it. You could not explain change as something becoming out of nothing. Because if you did, you understand what that means. If you saw a change and said that was spontaneous, it had no connection, there were no rules to the change, nothing persisted from what was before, it was ex nihilo, it was something that actualized out of nothing, then you were dealing in a magical universe. Then you're dealing in a mythic universe. You might as well say the gods did it. You could not do a science by saying, here we are in this meteorological classroom trying to understand some of the givens of weather. And guess what? There are no rules. Things happen out of nothing. There's nothing that we can derive directions from, see movement consistently and comparatively with other movements that we see. It's magical. Then you throw up your hands and you say, there is no curriculum, there is no purpose, there is no way of explaining anything that happens. Change, Aristotle understood, had to have something permanent underlying it that generated commonalities with other similar changes, and rules and laws could be discovered about them. So if a being changes into another being, something permanent must exist that is common to the two terms. Otherwise, there would be no transformation, but merely a succession by the annihilation of the first term and the creation of the second. But the being that fully is, remember our Parmenides, and who was always worried about what it meant to, he and Zeno, to deny change, because he says, look, what is has to be. The being that fully is, in actuality, cannot be in the act of transforming. So Aristotle explains it in terms of actuality and potentiality. Something moves, so there is cold water that becomes hot water. The cold doesn't become hot. The water is actually cold and potentially hot, and by applying a series of causes, one of which might be putting a fire underneath it, which would be a good agent cause right there, for the purpose of what? Perhaps cooking something, the final cause, that the actually cold and potentially hot transforms into, with water still, the water that was at the base still being there permanently, moves to actually hot and now potentially cold after the change. So when a change occurs and determinate matter exchanges one form for another, it moves, for example, from potentially hot to actually hot. And that little diagram I had used earlier in the course about change, form one to form two with the underlying matter, that is the permanent principle. For the sake of which a thing is, final cause, is its principle. And the becoming is for the sake of the end. And the actuality is the end. And it is for the sake of this that the potentiality is acquired. For animals do not see in order that they may have sight, but they have sight in order that they may see. So he's anticipating even evolution. as a kind of functional movement from potential to actual. Further, matter exists potentially because it may attain to the form. But when it exists actually, it is then in the form. The explanation of causation is central to this explanation of change. And that little diagram contrasting Plato with Aristotle and the relationship of form to matter, in the diagram you can see on the Plato side, on the left side, the ideal form of the apple, and down there in the world of matter, the actual things called apples that all participate, imitate, and try to share in the form. In Aristotle, form and matter only they exist. Form does exist, but it exists with matter in the actual thing and the actualized thing. He said, if you want to understand apple, the idea apple, you don't, and using Plato's language, you don't remember or recollect the pure form of apple in some aha moment. He says, what you're doing is you're looking at what all apples have in common. You're looking at the world of apples. Bring me in bushels and bushels of apples. I'm going to look, in my experience, I'm the toddler, I'm going to look at all these apples, and I am going to, through an act of abstraction, understand the classifiable form that is the definition of apple. I will learn the form directly from sense observations of real apples in the world, because the form and matter are in their aspects of the thing in itself. For Plato, that form was separable, existed in a higher realm, and apples as they existed in the material world somehow copied that realm. So Plato, in the starred box at the bottom of the slide, Plato theorized forms as having a separate existence from substances in the world. Aristotle theorized forms in particular individual things. The mind, that's a typo, it should be the mind, not they mind. The mind apprehends the universals in things. The mind apprehends the universals in things. He turns to the study of the human psyche, but not just the human psyche, or what he calls soul, psyche, what he calls soul. He sees it as an aspect of everything that exists in the world. The soul is the form and final cause of living things. So inanimate things don't have souls, but for him, everything else did. Plant, animal, human. The soul is the cause or source of the living body. The terms cause and source have many senses, but the soul is the cause of the body alike in all three senses, which we explicitly recognize. It is A, the source or origin of movement. What do living bodies do? They move. They've got locomotion. It is B, the end. It's the purpose. It's what they are in the world. It's the very essence, and which is C, the essence of the whole living body. That it is the last is clear, for in everything the essence is identical with the ground of its being. And here, in the case of living things, their being is to live. And of their being and their living, the soul in them is the cause or source. So for him, it's not this sort of ghostly abstraction that we've evolved in religious thinking of the last couple of millennium. For him, it is the spark the livingness of the thing, the aliveness of the thing. It is manifest that the soul is also the final cause of its body. And he says this in Dhyana. And then he starts talking about a three-part structure of the soul. And you see in the diagram, before I read the quote, you see it in the diagram on the right. So plants have the so-called vegetative soul, by which he means the principles of reproduction and growth are built in. And then animals, the sensitive soul, add to that. It's a superset. They can reproduce, they can grow, but they also have mobility and sensation. Some would argue that even plants have some level of sensation. I don't know, but the classical model, they didn't, but certainly squirrels do, and certainly dogs do. And then the human is a further superset. It's got all of that stuff, but it has reflective intellectual life. There's a rational soul. So he sees, and you see how this classifying impulse of his, everything is fit into a perfect hierarchy and explained, much the way I want to point out that we still think of it, right? We still talk about parts of our involuntary system as, our reptile brain kind of thing, lower level functions and higher level functions. The way we organize our thinking about the world is directly in line and a result of the way Aristotle started classifying, hierarchicalizing, and thinking about the world around him. Of the psychic powers above enumerated, some kinds of living things, as we have said, possess all, some less than all, others one only. Those we have mentioned are the nutritive, the appetitive, the sensory, the locomotive, and the power of thinking. Plants have none of the first, the nutritive, while another order of living things has this plus the sensory. Certain kinds of animals possess, in addition, the power of locomotion, and still another order of animate beings, that is man, the power of thinking, that is mind. And indeed, it isn't just these sort of three hard cubicles that he's organized it all into. He thinks of his entire spectrum, and he will start building these great biological trees of higher and lower functioning. So he would see, as modern zoologists and biologists do, that all primates are organized in a kind of tree of higher to lower capabilities of thought, of motion, of movement, of instinct. Thought, perception, and imagination. Thinking is different from perceiving and is held to be in part imagination, in part judgment. We must therefore mark off the sphere of imagination and then speak of judgment, he says in Dhyana. So he classifies he's going to classify the way the mind works. In biology, his observation of natural phenomena was detailed, incredibly detailed and comprehensive. He made several discoveries that speak to his serious attention to empirical observation. So working, for instance, one of the stories, working with fishermen on Lesbos, the island, he was able to accurately describe an array of fish and cephalopods. So very accurately, he laid down the relation inadvertently and not understanding evolution the way we have come to think about it. He organized them into a hierarchy that speaks of an evolutionary path. His description of octopus reproduction, while being wrong, was sufficiently detailed that it was believed into the 19th century before somebody figured out that he wasn't quite right about it. He was the first to classify living things based on their functional potential, their taxonomic higher to lower organizational principles. So for instance, he had a category for hot-blooded vertebrates and another for cold-blooded vertebrates, higher and lower. His scientific method it wasn't, I didn't mean to jump there. It wasn't experimental as such. It was largely inferential, but there was some stuff that actually he did experiment with. But in this example, though, for example, he was able to conclude that brood size decreases and gestation period increases as body mass increases. So, for instance, in a litter of mice, the brood size is quite large, okay? And the gestation period is quite short. And mice are little. But in elephants, the brood size is quite small. You don't have litters of baby elephants as such. And the gestation period is very long. It's like 20 months or something like that. And elephants are very big. And he noticed that relationship and was able to apply it to the description of other animals. I can look at their size and I can determine some laws about gestation periods and how many offspring they're likely to have. In physics, in optics, astronomy, geology, meteorology, he touched on huge range of topics. He noted, for instance, that geological change was too slow to be observed within a human's lifespan. He figured it out. He understood desalination. Quote, salt water, when it turns into vapor, becomes sweet, and the vapor does not form salt water when it condenses again. This I know by experiment, he says in a lecture, some lecture notes that are titled The Book on Meteorology. He formulated laws of motion that actually held until being disproved by Galileo in the 17th century. So we're talking 2,000 years of currency. The ethics and particularly in the Neo-Nicaean ethics, the idea, he elaborates the idea of the good life. And this is where we're going to see very concretely a central difference between him and Plato. And we're going to get a sense of how radically different a worldview this is, despite the fact that one was teacher and one was student. Happiness, eudaimonia, man's function, his ethical excellence, ethike arete, is to flourish, that is to achieve happiness. It is a practice. So he gets this from that standard way of examining the universe. I'm going to look at the function of a thing or a being and determine what the final cause of that function is. And he says, well, happiness is clearly the goal of human life. It is a practical goal that must utilize the special human excellence of rationality, phronesis, which is prudence or applied wisdom, as opposed to sophia, which is sort of intellectual philosophical wisdom. Phronesis, what is the highest of all goods that action can achieve? We may say that the majority of mankind are agreed upon this, about this. For both the multitude and meaning the mob, the hoi polloi, and persons of refinement, the intellectuals, the aristoi, the best men, speak of it as happiness. Everybody agrees. And conceive the good life or doing well to be the same thing as being happy. But what constitutes happiness is a matter of dispute. People identify it with some obvious and visible good, such as pleasure or wealth or honor. Some say one thing and some another. And some thinkers believe that beside the many good things, there exists another good that is good in itself. So here he refers to Plato. Some thinkers think, and stands to all these goods as the cause of their being good. He says of seeking the Platonic good. Now he specifically is going to talk about Plato a bit. Even if there is some one good, which is universally predicable of goods, of all the other goods, or is capable of separate and independent existence, clearly, I can't emphasize this enough, clearly, it could not be achieved or attained by man. But we are now seeking something attainable. So he's saying, look, I can't disprove this Platonic idea that there is in this other nether realm, that there is a good beyond what we down here in the real world take as practical goods. I can't disprove that. But even if it existed, it ain't attainable by us. So we've got to stick closer to the metal, folks. We've got to look at what people, practically speaking, really want to get out of life. And so he wants to look at people like a scientist. He's asking an ethical question. In Plato, all the usual ethical alternatives were discussed by everybody from Thrasymachus all the way up through Adeimantus. And it was only in the discussion with Glaucon that the character Socrates begins to suggest that, and this is the part that Christianity came to love later on, began to suggest that there is this ethereal, far away, super duper good that is the ground of all yearning, something so literally inspirational, something so spiritual, something that was such a reach that everything that you do would, if you had the philosophical insight to get a whiff of this thing, you would do everything in your power to achieve this. But the implication of that is that we here down at street level, you watch people in their actual lives. This is what Thrasymachus was trying to tell Socrates. He says, look at the way people actually do act down here. This is what they want. They want control. They want all the appetitive goals that the tyrant desires. They want to have big cars. They want to have, houses in the Hamptons. This is what real people of flesh and blood do. And here is Aristotle saying, well, as opposed to Plato, I actually do want to begin by looking at what real people do. Plato would have been horrified. Remember, the world, the physical world, the world of implemented individual things and people and animals in the physical world, for Plato, we're always imperfect copies. You see where Christianity takes off from this. The idea is through grace to achieve a kind of perfection. We are all born into sin, and we must be redeemed and be raised to a goal that only the Son of God, who is beyond the immanent world that we find ourselves in, can raise us up to. Here's Aristotle saying, no, I want to look at the actual world of actual people and see if we can decide. And he says, and I know there are a lot of vulgar people down here, as well as people of substance. We have every variety. I'm a classifier. I'm a scientist. I know all of this exists. I want to see if in looking at this world as it exists, as a scientist, I can distill some sense of what right-minded happiness would be, looking at all the extremes that I find in looking at all the people who really do exist in the world. If I look at all the dogs in the world, I see some smart ones, I see attack dogs, I see mangy dogs, I see dogs of, what is a good, healthy dog? What is a good, ethical person? So the practical goal is happiness. He says at the bottom of this slide, happiness we choose always for itself, never for the sake of something else. Honor, pleasure, reason, and every virtue we choose, indeed for themselves, for if nothing resulted from them, we should still choose each of them. But we choose them also for the sake of happiness. Yes, I want honor. I like the idea of honor. But to achieve honor would make me happy. Judging that by means of them, we shall be happy. Virtue. Aristotle goes on to say that happiness is an activity that entails the practice of virtue. The word ethike that he uses derives from the word ethos, the word for character in Greek. Since happiness is an activity of soul in accordance with perfect virtue, we've got to say, now he's looking at the world of real men. Well, there are a lot of vicious men and very few virtuous men. So how do we see virtue in looking at this whole panoply, this whole range of the human circus? We must consider the nature of virtue, for perhaps we shall thus see better the nature of happiness. We say that some of the virtues are intellectual and others moral. So philosophical wisdom and understanding and practical wisdom being intellectual. Liberality and temperance being moral. For in speaking about a man's character, we do not say that he is wise or has understanding, but that he is good-tempered or temperate. Yet we praise the wise man also with respect to his state of mind and states of mind. We call those which merit praise virtues. And then he introduces one of the great Aristotelian concepts, the mean. The practice of any activity can lead to excesses, too much or too little. A change, which is the goal, moves from potential to actual. So a defective change is one that achieves too much or too little. It is the nature of such things to be destroyed by defect and excess. So too is it then in the case of temperance and courage and the other virtues. For the man who flies from and fears everything and does not stand his ground against anything, we call a coward. And the man who fears nothing at all, but goes to meet every danger, we think of as rash. And similarly, the man who indulges in every pleasure and abstains from none becomes self-indulgent, while the man who shuns every pleasure, as boors do, becomes in a way insensible. So temperance and courage are destroyed by excess and defect, by too much or too little, but preserved by the mean, the middle ground, the golden mean. And here he describes what he means by this. The virtues that characterize the happy man are a balance between extremes of vices. That moral virtue is a mean, then, and in what sense it is so, and that it is a mean, between two vices, the one involving excess, the other deficiency, and that it is such because its character is to aim at what is intermediate in passions and actions has been sufficiently stated. Hence, also, it is no easy task to be good. For in everything, it is no easy task to find the middle. For example, to find the middle of a circle is not for everyone, but for him who knows. Anyone can get angry. That is easy. Or give or spend money. That is easy. But to do this to the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, with the right motive and the right way, that is not for everyone, nor is it easy. Wherefore, goodness is both rare and laudable and noble. So, and with his usual thoroughness, Aristotle goes on to classify what men regard as the core virtues and their corresponding vices of defects and excess. So we have this table in which there are the virtues in the middle column. There are balance, courage, generosity, ambition, modesty, honesty, good humor, friendship, temperance, composure, self-control. And there, for each of these virtues, there is a deficiency, a vice, for the lack of enough, and an excess, too much. So there's cowardice and rashness. So the generous person can be stingy or extravagant. The ambitious person can be slothful or greedy. The modest person can be overly humble or overly prideful. Honesty, one could be too secretive, one could be too loquacious or talkative, etc., all the way through. You see, by the way, how in Plato's world, in which there is this abstracted, high, inspiring goal, it's okay, as it would be in the Christian world when Neoplatonism begins to define a lot of Christian thought. It's okay to be an ascetic, to be a monk or a nun. It's okay to sacrifice the indulgence of all the physical senses if it helps with the discipline that's required in pursuing this superhuman, barely achievable lifetime goal of coming to God or coming to the good for Plato. Aristotle is on the other extreme. Here is the scientist who says, let me look at all of humanity, virtuous people, vicious people, fat people, skinny people, active people, sedentary people. Let me look at the full panoply of human possibility. And by observing that and classifying what we admire and what we find to be excessive in either extreme, too much or too little, come up with this idea that there is a golden mean. So he looks into the world and at the world, and he says, in this sea of changeability, of range, of possibility, of wildly different implementations, I can, by correctly classifying, good scientist that I am, come up with a model of virtue, come up with a model of happiness. Okay? Whereas Plato looks at the world of particulars, the physical world around him, and says, don't you understand that there is nothing in that world that can tell you about what the good is? Just like there's no dog in the world or that could tell you about the ideal dog, ultimately. that this has got to be understood inside out. Here is this person looking at the world much the way, I always think of Aristotle as sort of the patron saint of a certain kind of modernist thinking, where we don't believe that there is a little golden yellow brick road leading us to the city of Oz. And we sort of have to look at all the concrete, practical alternatives that we're faced with, and then hammer out of that an idea of proper behavior and good laws and direction, if you will. Now, in the traditional Greek world, Aristotle, in one sense, he is the modern I've just described, but in the traditional Greek world, the admirable person was characterized by the term that they called sophrosine. I mentioned it in this little box in the lower left. It's the Greek ideal of moderation, which this is very resonant with. At the same time that he's very modern, he's very traditionalist in another sense. The moderate man or woman, the moderate human, is the person who has struck the best balance. And indeed, the kalos agathon, the Athenian ideal of the perfect, the Alcibiades, the perfect young man, was to be beautiful and good, and Alcibiades violated it only because of his extreme pride. He did not hold himself in moderate balance. He was not characterized by sophrosine, by moderation. Now, extending this to political theory, once you've said that the idea of the best human behavior in the individual is going to be something that you are going to correctly analyze by observing real people, you're then forced to say, in effect, well, the best organization of a political entity, of a city, of a country, of a nation state, is going to proceed along the same lines and grow out of the ethical model that you have just spent all your time building. So the polis, man is by nature a political animal, he says in the Politics. By nature, a political animal. Not accidentally a political animal. Built in. With his roots in the small city culture of the Greek polis, Aristotle regarded the goal of politics to be the highest possible community good, a partnership, a koinonia, to help citizens achieve the ethical idea of the good life. The city, in his hierarchy, is even a higher, taxonomically, a higher form of unit than the family. It's even more important than the family. And it doesn't exist for the family. The family sort of exists for the polis. When several villages are united, he says, in a single complete community, large enough to be nearly or quite self-sufficing, the state comes into existence. There is no such thing as a state until you get enough people together so that it doesn't have to be kind of nomadic tribal existence. So the minimal buy-in for the existence of a state is a kind of self-sufficiency, originating in the bare needs of life and continuing in existence for the sake of a good life. So first you learn how to feed yourselves, you make yourself shoes and weapons and whatever else you need, and transportation. And then next, you devote yourself to achieving the good life, spoken like a true Athenian. And therefore, if the earlier forms of society are natural, so family is a natural form of social organization, so is the state. So for it is the end of them, meaning the goal, the telos, the arete. If their function is to be organized in this larger unit, that is their goal, that is their nature. They are essentially constructed for the purpose of being in these cities that they built. And he says, again, the political partnership must be regarded, therefore, as being for the sake of noble actions, not for the sake of living together. It isn't just expedient. It's for we can achieve our highest virtue living in community. And we're social animals. We're political animals. It's our responsibility. And then he goes on to classify forms of government. And he presents various forms of government. And by the way, this becomes the model, this analysis, that will carry all the way from Aristotle through the Middle Ages. There will be historians and philosophers and political theorists who will organize the ways of thinking about different forms of government on the model that Aristotle constructed in his Politics, right here. The true form, I jumped that sentence. Aristotle presents various forms of government that, when wielded in the interests of the community, are good, but when wielded out of self-interest are decadent or perverse. So if you see that little box diagram on the right, he talks about three organized units, organizational principles, one being a single ruler, the other one being a small set of rulers, and then the final one being many rulers, or the rule of all. And he says, and for each of these, there is a golden mean, an ideal version, a version which exists for the common community good. So if it's one ruler, kingship is the name that he gives to the version of one ruler that is devoted to the good of the community. Plato's philosopher king. The tyrant, however, the deviant of the form, is the rule by one person who is devoted to their self-interest, and this is a perversion or a deviance. Few rulers, the correct version, and is an aristocracy, and he calls the deviant version an oligarchy, out for their own interests, not for the interests of the whole community. And of the many rulers, he said the correct version, he calls it a polity. And democracy is, for his purpose, is mob rule, and it is a deviant. It's got a pejorative quality to it. We tend to think, we use the word to mean what he calls polity, but he says, oh, no, there's a deviant version of that. This is mob rule. This is Tammany Hall under Tweed in New York. And the kingship, using the left column, because of its efficiency, the philosopher king, would be the best version of the healthy model. Aristocracy would be the second best version of the healthy model, and polity would be the third best version of the healthy model. Tyranny would be the absolute worst because of its efficiency version. It's Stalin of the deviant model. Oligarchy would be the second worst version of the deviant, on the deviant side. And mob rule would be the least bad version, mainly because democracies tended to be inefficient. The true forms of government, therefore, are those in which the one or the few or the many govern with a view to the common interest. But governments which rule with a view to the private interest, whether of the one or of the few or of the many, are perversions. So the benevolent king, like Plato's philosopher king, would be the best possible ruler. His perversion would be the worst. So here we have it, the man who invented the study of everything, because of the sheer breadth depth and unity of his work, which was sprung on the world at a critical juncture in the advent of literacy, which is what I've been arguing for this entire set of lectures. It happens just at the right point in time, and probably only could have happened because of the advent of literacy. Aristotle single-handedly determined the shape of the classical curriculum. His genius for encyclopedic classification of all knowledge made him a god in the Western tradition. The Hellenistic period, the period when Greek intellectual life spread all over the Mediterranean, mainly because of Alexander spreading Greek influence into Asia and to North Africa. The curriculum makes it to Asia and North Africa, as well as Europe. And it wound up in that period. So the period between, let's say, the death of Alexander in 323 and the full success of the Roman Republican model by 150 BC. So we'll take it back down a little further into the 130s, let's say, by the Gracchi. So give it 2 centuries. In the next 2 centuries, and Hellenism is actually longer than 2 centuries old, in that period, it gets institutionalized. In other words, when somebody has now studied or has an interest triggered by Aristotle and one of his books, or by one of the other Greeks writing in the spirit of Aristotle or teaching in the spirit of Aristotle, gets interested in some topic and goes to answer the questions raised or wants to make observations about things that have been claimed before, whether it's about astronomy or whatever, they are going to very often write in Greek. It was the language of the curriculum. Your thinking was framed in Greek, even if it's your second language, much as Latin will take over for Europe in a later period into the Middle Ages and become the language that every person who studies speaks and reads. That's why the student quarter of Paris is called the Latin Quarter. And much the way French functioned in intellectual circles in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, and much the way English, you study medicine in Italy right now, you study in English. So you can read the medical literature, which is being published everywhere, in Germany, in China, in Australia, in Egypt. Publications are going to be in English now. The downside of his just massive reputation, his so-called authority, he was always quoted as having the final authority. He was the ender of discussions and arguments and debates through the Middle Ages. Somebody says, I can prove from Aristotle that this has got to be the case, was such that even his greatest errors, and I give an example here, think of the geocentric universe, the idea that the Earth is the center of our solar system, not the sun, wouldn't be called into question until the scientific revolution of the 17th century. His reputation was so powerful that it defied the people who were saying, hey, mathematically, I got a much simpler model for explaining the motions of the orbs of our solar system. He was simply the philosopher. This quote, he penetrated into the whole universe of things and subjected its scattered wealth to intelligence. And to him, the greater number of the philosophical sciences owe their origin and distinction. And who said this? Hegel said this in, I guess it would have been somewhere between 1800 and 1815. So here we are, 22 centuries later, and Hegel is saying this. And in this just wonderful portrait that we have, Aristotle with a bust of Homer, or Rembrandt from the Dutch Golden Age in the 1650s. And it's what it embodies as an image, everything I've been trying to argue in this series of lectures. What do you have? Homer, Aristotle's hand on the head of the bust of Homer. We have moved from oral epic to the curriculum. And here it is in framed in one portrait. I have to think that Rembrandt saw these two as the alpha and the omega of the transition that I've been describing since the first day of the class. And we are back with our last slide, which was, as you recall, our first slide, except for the little further stuff added into it. We argued that there was this cultural transition from tribal organization to political organization, from oral transmission to literary transmission, from mythic explanations to analytic, rationalist, scientific explanations, winding up with the full curriculum unveiled by the time we get to Aristotle. And I had asked the questions at the beginning, why the Greeks? Why at this time? What were the driving forces? What was the historical impact? And the first three of these, why the Greeks, why at this time, what were the driving forces? And I really have to think that the environment of those small cities that are participatory, citizens talking to citizens, that are diverse because they're coastal sea trading towns of many Greek ethnicities, not to mention foreigners who were trading at the ports, with strong literacy traditions, thanks to Homer beginning to write it all down, that environment, I don't think these people were smarter than anybody anywhere else. I think the circumstances for the exchange of ideas, for cultural comparisons, and for asking questions were all there. People who are hopping around the Mediterranean trading goods, who are aware of the religious theories of many different groups. It's in comparing, oh, these people think this is God, and we think that's God. And here the Greeks have all these different aspects of Zeus, depending on where they are and what their oral traditions were. Let me compare all these. And in the act of comparison, there is the act of classification. There is the act of stopping the music and sitting down and asking quietly, maybe there was something before, and there were all these different versions of the same language. Maybe there was something that these all derive from. How come we think of it this way, as that way? You had Herodotus comparing Egyptian religion to Greek religion and saying, I think they do this better than we do. That those environments of thinking about and comparing and classifying and exchanging ideas, I think made the difference. And then why was the historical impact so massive? They got there first. They got there first. And they had Alexander to spread it around. Anyhow, that is it. And I will.
I have a question.
Yeah, let me unpin. Where did I go here? Let me. And there we go. Remove the pin. And let's have questions.
I have a question. Could you comment on Aristotle's view of women and how that affected future thought about women?
I'm thinking that he, in one sense, was a Greek traditionalist who probably saw women in particular roles and functions in things like family life and political life, but whose, by observation, whose sense, and I'm saying this, by the way, not knowing direct quotations from him on aspects of this, because I'm not in memory aware of having seen any. But I'm thinking that given his ability to observe ranges of talent and capacity and accomplishment, and remember, he spent a good chunk of time around the educated, moneyed classes of Athens, that he, of course, would have understood that the distribution of talent, intelligence, and competence was not gender bound. I mean, he was too good an observational scientist to have that lost on him, is what I think.
It was my understanding that Plato thought of women in much more equalitative way than.
Well, Plato, who actually comes from the social class that would have had many talented women in it. I mean, he was one of these young aristocrats. In sections of Republic, makes it clear that social roles are not to be, in the ideal city, in the Republic, are not to be gender specific. I mean, he explicitly makes that claim. You're right. But I won't say I won't say that Aristotle did not share that. It's just that I don't know him addressing it. He wasn't there trying to build a new way of organizing the city. Remember, Plato's idea of the ideal was that nothing in the realized world was what it should be. Everything was sort of an imperfect copy. So he's going back to a drawing board and trying to say, well, in a perfect city, what would that look like? Well, we're not going to have any gender distinctions in the perfect city. In Aristotle's approach to the world, he's much closer to asking the question, how do real cities look? How are they organized? What are they like? And what's good about the best of them and bad about the worst of them? So he's starting with what is the case, not with what ought to be the case, and trying to derive a model from that. And so, in what is the case, women were much more socially restricted in his world. But he's not running around building theories of totally ripping apart the architecture of every city, the social architecture, and building it up from scratch. Plato was also talking about taking children away from their families right after, almost on a Spartan model, right after toddlerhood, and giving them to, if you will, schools in the service of the entire town. In his model, I mean, a model that would look in some ways like a very, sort of a Maoist, totalitarian footprint, and has been accused of that. At the same time, the idea that he was leveling everybody is absolutely true.
Lou, did Aristotle deal with adaptation to environment, such as in locomotion, fish swim, birds fly, and how they gather food?
So you mean like selection, like genetic selection? I doubt it. I don't know his biological writings as well as I know his logic, his ethical and political writings. So I really have trouble. I don't know. I would doubt that, even though even among the pre-Socratics who found fossils, fish fossils on mountaintops, understood that change in the world was on a long arc and that those mountains had once been covered by water. So they had a lot of things in place. They weren't running around saying the world is 4,000 years old. Any other?
So I think you had said something about the small city concept being a result of the end of the Peloponnesian War. Am I making that up? I thought you had talked about.
It was an earlier development that goes back to the Archaic period, but that it became the perfect occasion for developing literacy tools and the kinds of comparative thinking that I've been talking about. In other words, I think that the town and literacy and scientific thinking are three aspects of exactly the same development that starts off in the 8th or 9th centuries BC and comes to fruition by the time we get to the 5th and 4th centuries.
And why is that? I mean, you would think that a bigger city, New York City, museums, libraries, the cultural epitome. Why was a small city able to have those kinds of resources and interchange? Because
it had diversity. You're speaking of a New York that has diversity because it's a modern city, but the kinds of cities that you would have found in Western Asia were often very authoritarian, top-down structures. Interestingly enough, the Israelites who lived in basically small, ethnically diverse cities also developed literacy traditions in the same period that were as sophisticated and indeed mapped to a lot of the same kinds of developments. It's just that they didn't have an Alexander. If Alexander had been speaking Hebrew and adopted the Aristotelian curriculum, we might have seen a different world.
I love your last picture, the painting of the
Rembrandt.
Homer. Yeah, that was fabulous.
For all of Aristotle's brilliance, it's a shame that he was culturally and ethnically limited in a way because he despised the Persians. I mean, he was supposed to have taught Alexander that treat the Greeks as if they are your friends and relatives and treat the Persians as if they are beasts or plants. His perspective was they were meant to just be plowed over and such. And in fact, they say that there was some thought that Alexander may have been assassinated, and they felt that since Aristotle so despised at that point Alexander for what he was doing with the cultural mixing, that they thought Aristotle may have actually had a hand in trying to organize the assassination of Alexander. And the kicker to that is that Alexander's inclusivity and cultural exchange caused Aristotle's ideas and teachings to be spread throughout the world,
Right. The thing that he's referring to is that Alexander practically forced all of his higher military advisors to marry Persian wives. when he got into Persia. And he was trying to facilitate a kind of merger of cultures, which was resisted because most of his military advisors were Macedonian. You have to understand, Macedon, up there way in northern Greece, was so far from being a cultural center that most Mediterranean Greeks did not even think of the Macedonians as Greek. They were these yahoos from beyond the border, and very few of them would have been tolerant of what they would have thought of as Athenian effeminacy, and they probably resented the idea that Alexander, who was quite an Enlightenment figure of his own, that he was asking them all to take Persian wives as he did Roxanne. I never heard about the rumor that Aristotle had a hand in that. You're right, though. He had no love. He was no Herodotus who sort of loved his Asian ancestry.
And the funny thing was that, he was speaking from the perspective that these barbarian Persians had tried to conquer the Greeks, when in fact, these barbarian Macedonians ended up succeeding in conquering the Greeks. As you said, they regard them completely as barbarians until they took over. And then it's like, hey, I guess these guys are okay after all.
That's right. And indeed, in some future course, I might look at the period that begins with Alexander, where you find Greek kingdoms of sorts, the successor kingdoms, all over the Eastern Mediterranean, awaiting the rise of the Roman Republic in the end, and creating what emerges as Greco-Roman civilization, a Roman world which still is heavily invested in Greek as a curriculum. I'm not going to have another course until the fall. So I got to figure out what that'll be. I'll let people know if we're all still here. And
thank you for putting these on YouTube, by the way, as well. Last week I had to leave the course, but you have these all on YouTube, which is great. Yeah. And you've been putting them up for like the last several years, so you can go back and immediately grab a hold of these if you missed them and such.
You sound like my publicist.
No, it's much appreciated.
The good news is, and by the way, I will send a follow-up when these 6 lectures are organized into a playlist on the portal, the Montclair YouTube portal. I will send an email that lists all the courses that are up there, or send the links along. There's one, and I'm going to include a link that I did for the adult school that's not in that portal, but is directly from Zoom that you can get to. That was of necessity. The good news is they're all there. The bad news is I've got to come up with new courses all the time because they're there.
Well, that's good for us.
Harold, I got to save my toes. Anyhow, it's been fun, gang. I have to admit, this is my favorite subject area. So
it shows.
It shows.
It's great.
Yeah, well, there we go.
Thanks a lot, Lou. Take care.
Bye-bye.